and Thursdays during the month of October and into early November. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I will provide a few brief opening remarks. As with so many things we were planning to do in person this year, our plans were derailed by the coronavirus, and here we are again online. This workshop was planned with the input of our ESIG Offerings Committee, chaired by Bethany Frew of NREL and Julia Matoy-Basan of ERCOT. The committee consists of the chairs of our 6 working groups and several of our board members. We have a great set of volunteers who make ESIG what it is, and we encourage you to become involved if you're not already. Regarding logistics, I would ask you to note that the webinar will be 1 hour and 15 minutes long, not the normal 1 hour. We will have 4 individual presentations of approximately 12 minutes each, and we plan to hold the questions for a 15-minute Q&A session after the last speaker. As we are doing with all our webinars now, we'll be using the Slido platform for managing the Q&A. We would ask you to use Slido for your questions, as you will not be able to ask your questions through WebEx. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG1 as the event code to ask your questions. Please be sure to indicate the person to whom you are addressing the question. The instructions are also in the background slide for the webinar, and you'll be reminded by the session chair. You will see a thumbs up button next to the question on Slido to allow you to vote on prioritizing the questions submitted. So please keep the questions coming during the presentations, and we will address them at the end. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with typically more than 100 people on the lines will be muted. So again, we ask you to use the Slido platform to ask your questions with ESIG1 as the event code. The opening plenary session today deals with a topic that's very much front and center in the news these days, 100% clean energy, however you may define it. We'll hear several different angles on this topic, from a seminal workshop ESIG held last year, which laid some groundwork for the Global Power System Transformation, or GPST initiative, to some very recent, timely work exploring pathways to get there. The session will be chaired by Rick O'Connell of GridLab, who is a member of our board of directors and a regular contributor to ESIG activities. Rick is a longtime friend and well known to many of you. Rick, we appreciate having you here, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. I appreciate the warm introduction, and I'm really thrilled to be here with this amazing panel. So we have a great panel for you today. I think Charlie teed us up nicely. I would just, introduce this. I think many of you listening in, and I know all the folks here on the panel have been thinking and working about clean energy for a long time. But we're just now starting to realize when we look economy-wide, and right now we're the Energy Systems Integration Group, so we're thinking about the whole economy, not just the power grid. We understand that, I think we're starting to understand we need to move a little bit faster on the power grid than we used to think, and that we can't be on a glide path to 2050, that actually the power grid really needs to decarbonize more quickly so we can use it to decarbonize other sectors. So I think I'll use that as an introduction to Dr. Amol Phadke, who is a good friend and a co-author, or the lead author. He's a lead author, which I was a co-author on. He's a senior scientist at UC Berkeley, an incredibly brilliant man, and has done work all over the world. But he today is going to talk about the 2035 report that UC Berkeley and GridLab put out earlier this year, and talk about some of the results. And then after that, Michael Boyle is going to talk about a companion policy paper that Energy Innovation, his organization, worked on that was a companion to the 2035 report. And then you'll notice the 2035 report talks about 90% by 2035. Luckily, we're not just leaving up at 90%. We're going to have Paul Denholm from NREL talk about the last 10%, and then follow it up with Mark O'Malley, who's going to give us a recap from the 100% workshop held last year, along with a really great introduction to a new organization that he's going to talk about. So with that, please, I'm excited to hand it over to Amol. Amol, please take it away.
All right. Thanks, Rick, and thanks for the opportunity to come to this panel and present. I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to run through some of my slides. So this report really looks at how we can decarbonize the electricity system much faster in the light of very dramatic declines in solar, wind, and battery storage costs. In terms of the excellent group that worked on this report, I'm of course from the Goldman School of Public Policy in UC Berkeley. I also hold an appointment as my primary appointment in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Of course, you all know GridLab and Rick, who was the DJ for this report. Energy Innovation did a brilliant companion report, and Climate Nexus basically helped us with communication. So these are kind of the core partners of the report. Rick partly covered this already, okay, why we did this analysis by looking at 90% clean by 2035. I think there are kind of three primary reasons. To this group, I don't really need to emphasize that we really need to move fast on climate mitigation. The IPCC says that we really have 10 to 15 years to turn around the energy systems. But more importantly, we saw that renewable energy costs and battery storage costs have fallen much faster than anticipated. So it's worth looking at how power sector can be decarbonized much quicker. The second reason that we did this is that a lot of the academic discussion, or a significant share of the academic discussion, is focused on 100% clean by 2050. And it is pretty well known that the last 10% is difficult to get. And what we thought was that that's a noble cause that one needs to do analysis and pursue all the technical work on. But I think it's also worth looking at how far and how fast we can go with existing technology. So those were kind of the primary reasons to do this work. And of course, the key factor is that the pathway for economy-wide decarbonization runs through electrification. So decarbonizing power sector much earlier is also a rationale why we need to do this. So this is, again, the primary motivation for the study. What I'm showing on this figure is how the projections of cost and their reductions have changed dramatically. What I'm showing is NREL's annual technology baseline projections starting 2015. So what this figure shows is, if you just even consider ATB 2016, what the projections were for cost reductions for 2030, those are already here. So I would argue that reductions have arrived about 10% earlier than anticipated just a few years ago. And similar graphs are shown on the for solar on the right-hand side. I want to also give a shout out to NREL, although they were not really part of this study. A lot of the work that this study did leveraged the annual technology baselines, which made it easier for us to do this work. In addition, NREL made its READS model public. I highly recommend using it. So thanks to that, we were able to conduct the study. So these are kind of all our results are really driven by cost assumptions, and we just want to be transparent about our cost assumptions. What this figure shows is what are our kind of cost assumptions and cost projections. What this figure shows that most of the cost reductions for solar, wind, and battery storage that have already occurred. So our cost projections don't rely on, our analysis doesn't rely on dramatic cost declines in the future. What we essentially did is used NREL ATB cost projections as NREL ATB 2019 cost projections as the basis for our cost projections. Our base case cost projections are essentially NREL ATB mid case in 2019. However, we used the NREL ATB low case until 2021 because actual costs seen in PPA matched the NREL ATB low until 2021. So we use those cost assumptions, but for the future cost reductions, we use the NREL mid case. And it turns out that the NREL ATB 2020 mid case actually matches with our base case cost assumption pretty nicely. So the first question we get asked is that, okay, if the costs have declined so rapidly, would the power system kind of clean itself up, given now we are talking about 2 to 3 cents LCOE for solar and wind, and battery costs have fallen significantly. So we basically simulated 2 cases in REEDS, which is NREL's capacity expansion model. And we looked at whether under a no new policy case, what happens to the electricity grid in terms of its capacity expansion. And that is shown on the right-hand side. And what we find is that although there is some increase in the solar, wind share and storage share in the BAU no new policy case, the increase is not that significant. And secondly, it is definitely not in line with what we need to do on climate. And why are we seeing this result? Because if the costs have declined so much, why isn't the grid cleaning itself up? The primary answer to that question is that in a relatively flat demand scenario, when most of the natural gas asset is already built, under current low natural gas prices, what's really happening is that the solar, wind, and storage really have to compete with only the going forward of natural gas power plants, which are the variable costs are below 2 cents per kWh or below 3 cents per kWh. And it's hard for wind and solar to compete with that and really dramatically increase its share on its own without any policy intervention. So that's why the system is not kind of cleaning itself up. Then we simulated a case of a 90% clean grid by 2035 and asked REITs to say, hey, give us the least cost mix of resources that will lead us there. And we just want to clarify that what we mean by clean is essentially carbon free. So it does include hydro and nuclear. So it's basically 70%. What the model tells us is basically 70% renewables. And the rest 20% is given by hydro and nuclear. And the remaining, there is 10% gas generation that remains because that's the constraint imposed on the model. So that's basically the clean energy generation mix, and the BAU basically needs continued significant use of natural gas. The second question that we get asked, which is a question, is what about the dependability of the grid? Like, okay, fine, that the how is the dependability of the grid managed in the 90% clean case? And to do that, we essentially modeled the system in Plexos. We used basically a 7-year weather simulation primarily using NREL's data. The system is modeled in a pretty detailed fashion, about 135 zones with some representation of transmission, and modeling about 20,000 individual generators in Plexos. And what I'm showing you here is kind of one of the worst week in that 7 weather year simulation. And essentially, during that worst week, the wind generation drops as much as like 80% of its average, 70% of its average value. And the way that the grid is managed by a combination of 350 gigawatt of existing gas generation, 150 gigawatt of storage, and the rest is essentially hydro and nuclear. And this represents kind of a conservative way of balancing the grid. There are several other options, including demand response and a few other things that can further optimize this picture. So what it tells us is that the infrequent use of existing gas assets is critical to balance the grid, but also about 150 gigawatts of storage makes a lot of difference. Here is the result that in fact is most exciting to us, which is the cost results. What we are finding is that the wholesale cost of the 90% clean case are actually in fact lower than today, although they are slightly higher than the unconstrained case. Now the wholesale costs include the generation cost, but also the incremental transmission cost. So they are below 5 cents per kWh, which is a very exciting news that today, so say wholesale costs are about 5 cents. We are finding 90% clean case, including incremental transmission costs. The costs are 5 cents. And we also consider the environmental benefits of this case, which are shown on the left-hand side. If you consider those, then the 90% clean case is overwhelmingly beneficial. We find that we avoid about $1.2 trillion of environmental damages up to 2050 in the clean case. This is ambitious, but we argue that it's feasible. It shows the build-out needed to we need to build about more than 1,000 gigawatts of renewable capacity. It requires basically 2 to 3x acceleration in the build-out of renewables compared to what's happening today. But because the geographically renewables have become cost-effective in most regions of the U.S., we argue that this is feasible. And equally importantly, we do an analysis of what are the impact on net jobs, and we find that there is significant increase in net jobs supported. We find about 500,000 of net jobs every year being supported in this case. So overall, we find that it's an incredible economic recovery opportunity it presents, because what we are saying is you could go 90% clean by 2035 without increasing consumer bills, maintaining the grid dependability, and also offering an incredible opportunity for jobs, as well as significant savings on the environment, the damage costs disproportionately fall on poor and disadvantaged communities. So I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amol. That was great. I happen to know that Amol and I are quite good at doing this presentation since we've done it for many folks over the last several months. That was great and a great introduction, and I see there's some good questions coming in. But perfect handoff. Now we're going to hand off to Michael Boyle, who's going to talk about the companion policy piece. So Amol's work really focused on the techno-economic feasibility of getting to 90% by 2035 and what the cost would be. And Mike's going to say, well, what are the policies that we need to get there? And I think he's got some great detail and really interesting stuff. So without further ado, Mike, please take us away.
Thank you, Rick. Hi, everyone. So I'm here as Amol teed up to talk about Energy Innovation's work in explaining and identifying the policies that can help us achieve the techno-economic potential that Amol and his team and Rick and GridLab helped show through the 2035 report. For those of you who aren't aware of Energy Innovation, we are a policy research organization located in San Francisco. And our mission is to accelerate clean energy by supporting policies that most effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And because of the falling cost of clean energy resources, it's our thesis really that the barriers to cleaning up the electricity grid are increasingly more institutional and less technical, at least as far as getting to 90% clean electricity. Although there are some, of course, research questions that you all at ESIG are taking on, and that I think the broader policy community is kind of relying on you all to figure out the engineering challenges associated with this. So I really support ESIG's work and look to you all for leadership and sort of the guardrails around what policies we can recommend to policymakers. So as Amol said, and you can see some symmetry between our slide formatting here, as Rick said, we've all sort of given this presentation together quite a few times. But in addition to just looking at this as an economic recovery opportunity and some relatively low-hanging fruit, given that the consumer costs are negative, it's worth noting that this thinking has actually become mainstream, as a platform for the Democratic Party and for the Biden campaign, who have said they have 2035 100% clean electricity as a core tenet of their climate plan. So, I think it speaks to the timeliness of this work, as well as what policymakers are willing to support. The overarching recommendation of our report is that investment and tax credits alone will not get us there. We need to adopt a national clean electricity standard that codifies a 90% goal by 2035 with interim goals every 5 years, and also gets to 100% by 2045, which, given the time between those two goals, we think is feasible. Again, as Amol pointed out, there's kind of a knife edge of cost, and even though there's customer savings to be had from achieving this goal, we need to codify it in order to make sure that all states are getting there. Something that's also going on, of course, is that states control their energy mixes and can create subsidies or extend the lives of fossil assets, and kind of control their energy mixes. So we need to have a forcing function to get monopoly utilities and markets to come along. So one of the biggest challenges of achieving this vision for the grid is ramping up deployment of renewables to, double historical maximums in the 2020s and then triple historical maximum deployment rates in the 2030s. So we have some recommendations for how to overcome those barriers. And I will say, the urgency of this is really increased as we consider electrifying other sectors at the same time. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I mean, this is already a really important step and a really ambitious goal. So, one of the first policies we need to address is the need to increase manufacturing capacity to meet this need. And to the extent it can also promote domestic job growth, that's all the better. So one of the really successful policies of the ARRA, the Obama stimulus package, was the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit, which is arguably responsible for nearly quadrupling wind manufacturing capacity in the United States over that time period. So reinstating that, we think, is a really good way to boost the manufacturing base as we seek to meet this goal. If we were to adopt a 90% clean electricity standard, we would also really need to reform the interconnection queue process. Rick has let me know that if you add up all of the monopoly utility and RTO interconnection queues, there are over 500 gigawatts of either hybrid, wind, solar, or storage projects in those queues right now. So that's nearly half of what's needed to be built all the way to 2035. I mean, of course, not all of those projects are going to get built regardless, but that just sort of shows like the developers are there, but the grid and those who regulate and decide what can interconnect and how much it will cost sort of stand as a barrier. So we really need to reform those queues to speed up interconnection processes and also start to plan transmission expansion proactively to accommodate these resources and deal with cost allocation in a way that may not be, it may not be palatable for individual states, but I think the federal government needs to play a more active role in promulgating rules for transmission costs.
Oops, it seems like we've lost Mike. Let's see if we can.
These particularly monopoly utilities don't have an incentive to accelerate the transition away from their existing fossil fleets towards renewables. And at the state level, we need to create a link between the profits of those utilities and accelerated transition to a clean electricity system. And then in case there is no federal standard adopted, we should consider reinstating federal support for wind, solar, and storage, which are really the best proxies we have for internalizing those environmental and health externalities that Amol recognized in the slide that quantified the environmental benefits of transitioning to a 90% clean electricity system. So the other big challenge is how do you facilitate the prompt and efficient coal retirements and also investment in flexible resources, whether that means keeping most of the existing gas fleet around, but for a much different purpose, as well as investment in storage resources, demand response, as Amol mentioned, and potentially new sources of flexibility. So one of the big items that I know is on ESIG's agenda is wholesale electricity market reform. There are practices that are allowed in wholesale markets and also market designs that are clear barriers to the transition toward a more renewable-centric grid. Self-scheduling is one. Capacity market design is another, and we need new products and to reform price caps and other ways that prices are formed to support sort of a complementary portfolio of flexibility resources. And then we really need to make sure that price responsive demand can participate more meaningfully in wholesale markets, and also deal with rate design so that individual customers can participate. Another big issue is sort of uneconomic coal assets that are on monopoly utility books. And so someone has to pay for those costs, and we can really reduce the cost of transition by providing debt financing, whether it's at the federal level or states can undertake ratepayer-backed securitized bonds to pay down the cost of those assets in order to get them off utility books, make these uneconomic coal plants no longer earning for utilities, so that what the next question becomes, how can they invest in a clean electricity future, not what will they lose by doing so. And of course, we need to provide support for coal communities, making sure that pension funds are fully funded and paying for their health, the health of coal workers, but also refilling the tax base. Many local communities depend on coal plants and coal mines, for services that will need to be paid for if we don't want those communities to suffer. So the transition is really the jobs benefit story is great, but the pain is sort of localized, and we need to be intentional about that. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide here because I'm running low on time. So there's also additional research needs, and our brief pulls heavily from the ESIG key research needs toward 100% renewable energy pathways document. So I would point you all to that if you haven't seen it yet. I have the Donald Rumsfeld quote here that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know There are some things we do not know. And when it comes to the renewable energy transition, we have some known unknowns that DOE, the national labs, and groups like ESIG need to continue working on. And of course, a larger budget from the federal government to research these issues certainly wouldn't hurt. So resource adequacy frameworks and metrics, that's coming up. I know that's a research track of ESIG. Developing and commercializing the most promising technologies that provide dispatchable, long-duration, zero-carbon energy is another issue, so that we can meet the challenge of getting from 90% to 100% and dealing with the sort of seasonal issues that come with variable renewables. We have to improve and standardize our dispatch and planning tools so that they're up to snuff for the high renewables grid, and also grid-forming inverters to maintain reliability and support system stability at higher penetrations of variable renewables is a key issue that we need to deal with. So that's sort of the end of my presentation. Thank you all. It was kind of the honor of my career so far to work with the folks at UC Berkeley and Amol's team on this report. So I'm just glad to be a part of the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And it was great to work with you. And I think that was I think a lot of you will see in those policy recommendations things that you are pretty familiar with, right? In terms of, resource adequacy, restructuring, interconnection queue reform. So things that a lot of people I know at ESIG and probably listening to this webinar are working on today. So now I see there's a whole bunch of great questions coming in, and a lot of them I think Paul is going to address in his presentation. So we gave Paul the hard set of questions, which is really the last 10%. Now remember, what Amol presented was 70% variable renewables, 20% what we call firm low carbon, hydro and nuclear, and 10% gas on an energy basis. And Paul's going to really talk us through how can we, what are the issues that we need to deal with on the last 10%? And I think a lot of the questions coming in are really going at this. So Paul, why don't you, for those of you who don't know Paul, he's at NREL. He's a senior analyst there. He's been there for a long time and one of the most thoughtful people I know on this idea. He's one of the folks that came up with the flexibility supply curve. He's got a cool new slide that I think many of you haven't seen yet that updates that. So with that, Paul, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Happy to be here and talk about the last 10%. I'm not sure this is going to be deeply insightful to most of the folks on the call. I think have spent a lot of time thinking about this, but we'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of these issues. And, just kind of some boilerplate stuff in terms of reminders, the fact that we've got a bunch of different things where you have to think about as we're approaching the last 10%, resource adequacy, grid stability issues, and all the way to land use and some of those other issues. But when we talk about the last 10% and the penetration, I kind of like to think about it in this term, because I've been doing this long enough that I remember when we couldn't go beyond 20%. And just Google it. You will find quotes from utility executives that say we cannot go past 10 to 20%. And they'll say it's a hard limit or we have to do all kinds of crazy changes. And we know that's not true. And so now we know that we can do a lot more. So we think about 80%. And really it's all about moving the goalposts or moving this curve to the right. And it's like, what do we do to bring the degree of difficulty and cost down as we increase penetration to higher and higher levels? And so I don't think we really talk about hard limits anymore. I think we just simply talk about at what point does it get so expensive that we have to start looking at an off-ramp, either looking at non-carbon, non-renewable options or something else. So I think this framework is still useful. We just have to be really careful about, what are we talking about when we talk about 80 or 90 or 100%? What do we really mean? Is this a technical issue? Is it an economic issue, et cetera? Okay, so when we talk about the last 10%, we've been thinking about framing this in terms of at NREL kind of these two challenges. And these were kind of, something our communications folks came up with in terms of thinking about this. We've boiled it down to this concept of the balance challenge and the inverter challenge. And the balance challenge is really what we're going to be talking about. Love to talk about the inverter challenge because I think some of the things like inertia, I think maybe are not as big of a deal as we've thought about in the last few years. But the big economic issue is probably this balance challenge or the mismatch of renewable energy supply and demand. Now, when we talk about that mismatch, again, we used to think about short-term variability. Oh, the sky is falling because we're going to need massive amounts of operating reserves because of wind and solar. And we know that because of the spatial diversity and because the fact that you don't drop 1,000 megawatts of PV in a minute. Clouds just don't move that fast. Wind fronts don't move that fast. It's less of a regulating reserve problem than a flexibility or ramping reserve problem, and that's just a lot easier to solve. So, that gets us past those issues that we used to think about at 10, 20%. And then we move into the diurnal mismatch problem, the fact that the sun doesn't shine at night, the wind that tends to blow more at night. That's where, quite frankly, the reduction in cost of things like lithium-ion batteries, spatial diversity really helps us kind of solve that problem and move us into that regime of that 80 to 90%. And so I'm not going to talk any more about that because, again, those are well on their ways to being solved problems. It really comes down to what happens beyond the diurnal problem. And, again, this is the slide that Rick was talking about. The point is that we no longer have to think about, all the different ways of getting to 80%. I mean, we do, but there's a whole lot of options now. I mean, lithium-ion batteries are one piece of that, but we've thought a lot, and utilities are taking active strides towards incorporating this kind of flexibility supply curve and thinking about next generation demand response, renewables providing reserves. We used to think about renewables as being these must-take resources. So you'd have these crazy things like utilities keeping thermal generators partially loaded just so they could maintain upward operating or downward operating reserves instead of getting that from renewables. And I think we're moving past that. So it really comes down to, okay, we know how to solve these diurnal problems, or we have pathways forward. I'm not saying these are solved problems. I'm not saying that this is we're going to be at 80 or 90% tomorrow. I mean, we have to implement these technologies, and quite frankly, under even aggressive transitions, we're looking at a multi-decadal transition towards the point where we have to deal with the beyond diurnal mismatch problem. So that really leads us to this seasonal problem. And so the question is, okay, what is the problem here, and how might we solve it? So just real quick, I know you guys all know this, but just as a reminder, because I do get a little frustrated when people talk about like the last 10%. The last 10% has always been expensive just because you have to build a ton of capacity with very low capacity factor. So when you look at, you do your LCOE calculation, figure out what a baseload plant costs, and then you look at the last 10 or last 2% of demand, even if you're doing it from gas, it's still going to be a lot more expensive than your quote-unquote baseload plant. So we have to make sure that we remind ourselves that, yeah, renewables get really expensive at the last 10%, but you have to compare it to the alternative, which also is going to be expensive. Now, it's still, it's a lot easier to do it with gas than it is with renewables. And here's why. So this is just a sample of LCOE as a function of penetration if you're deploying either a renewable mix, a mix of wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries versus, at this case, we're looking at just a simple cycle gas turbine with something like $5 gas. So if we start at 75, 80% renewables, the renewable system is going to be cheaper even without a carbon tax. Even without any carbon costs, renewables are going to be cheaper than a new combustion turbine. And so at some point, however, because the declining capacity factor and declining capacity credit of wind and solar, because that declines a lot faster than a gas turbine, the cost curve becomes more steep for renewable-based systems. So if you follow that orange curve up, you're going to see it intersects with the fossil-based system at maybe 80%. And if you put in like a $50 per ton carbon cost, at some point a little bit beyond 90%, gas is cheaper, even with that carbon cost. So the problem, of course, is that diurnal mismatch has been solved, and now we have run into that seasonal problem. So the issue is, then this is an example of a bunch of 95% scenario systems showing that this seasonal mismatch. It's the fact that we've got too much generation in the spring that we're throwing away. We can't do anything more with diurnal storage. I mean, you can see that there's no kind of diurnal variation between the orange and the blue lines. The orange is what's left. The blue is what's got available. Now you can see in Florida, maybe there's some diurnal. What we want to do is you want to shift the blue into the orange. But for most of the time, look at Texas, look at California, you got tons of renewables available. You're not going to store it diurnally because you'd have to you'd charge up your battery in May and you'd sit there and wait until August to discharge it. So the capacity factor has dropped to, incredibly low numbers. The costs, like I showed in that previous slide, the costs rise dramatically. And so this is the seasonal problem in a nutshell. And the question is, how are we going to solve this in fully decarbonized systems if you want to do it all with renewable energy? So I would say that there's three classes of solutions that people talk about. One is continued push on renewable energy and diurnal storage. The second is demand response. The third is seasonal storage. So maybe a fourth. So just really briefly to talk about each. The first is, how far can we push this idea of just building out more wind and solar and curtailing it? Maybe you get a PV plant with a 5% capacity factor, wind plant with a 10% capacity factor. I mean, if you've got 1 cent wind, 1 cent solar, and storage that's way under $100 per kWh, maybe that's fine. I don't know. It's hard for me to see it, much past 95%, because really, you look at the marginal costs, they get really high, but we don't know how far we can go. So that's one question is, how far can we go without seasonal storage? Load flexibility. This is interesting. I don't really know anything about this. We think about flexible loads. I tend to think about it more on diurnal basis, the shifting of electric vehicle charging, things like that. But, think creatively. What happens if we turn off industry for a few weeks a year? Could that actually be cheaper than building new combustion turbines? Could that be cheaper than even in the non-carbon kits? We have some evidence, of that already. But, again, this isn't my expertise, so I just have no idea whether or not you can actually do seasonal shifting with industry. Again, you really need a low capital cost, high variable cost type of industry, something with capital costs really cheap so that a reduced capacity factor, not running that plant 24/7 makes sense. Again, I think we need to do a lot of work on this topic because maybe this is the answer and we don't understand it well enough. Okay, so that takes us to seasonal storage, and that's the thing that we talk about. If you look at the European literature, all of the 100% studies that have been done in Europe, and way more stuff has been done in Europe than in the U.S. on this topic. Power to gas, we make some kind of thing in the spring, right? You make hydrogen, you turn that hydrogen into methane or ammonia, you store it in an underground cavern, you burn it in a CT 4 months later, you stick it into a hopefully what would become a super cheap proton exchange membrane fuel cell, and problem solved. And that's great. The problem, of course, now is all of this is super expensive. Electrolyzers are expensive. Fuel cells are expensive. CTs aren't that expensive. But when you look at like the levelized cost of gas from low carbon resources, right now you're talking north of $30 per million BTU. So it doesn't really make sense, even with a pretty aggressive carbon tax. But then you get into these really interesting questions of, well, we're really no longer talking about the electric sector, right? If you're making methane, ammonia, or other hydrocarbons, synthetic hydrocarbons, you're probably doing tons of other stuff with that, right? You're making chemicals, plastics, district heating. I don't know what all the things you're doing with it, but this isn't about just storing it for use in electricity. And that's where I can't do anything with it because I'm an electric sector analyst, and now you're asking me to run the economy-wide multi-sector. I don't know how to do any of that stuff. So how much of the hydrogen we produce for seasonal storage is actually going into the electric sector? Maybe 10% of it. So we're going to have to get way smarter about this multi-sector analysis to understand whether or not this all this stuff makes sense. Okay, so there's the three options, but let's talk about a fourth. We just heard 90%. If we do 90%, we heavily electrify transportation, we heavily electrify everything else. Are we done? Should we just stop and say, okay, fine, maybe if you really need more carbon, you go with CCS from fossil, direct air capture, biomass CCS, and get negative carbon. I don't know, but again, when we were talking 15 years ago of getting to 10 to 20%, now we're talking about 90. That makes me pretty happy. So that's what I have, and happy to engage in conversation later. Thanks.
Great, Paul. That was excellent. Yeah, and maybe I think I think 100% is a really important and aspirational goal. But if we got the electric sector down to 90%, the electric sector would now just be roughly 3% of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions, at least just talking in sort of the U.S. perspective. And so at that point, we've got, if you really care about the marginal cost of carbon abatement, you should be really focused on other sectors. And that's, I think, part of the point of our 90% study was like, let's move as fast as we can, get as much as carbon quickly and cheaply out of the electric sector as we can, and leave the last 10% for, like you said, this complex solution set. How's it going to work? And luckily, we have the Energy Systems Integration Group that is thinking holistically about this. And luckily, we also have Professor Mark O'Malley from Europe, who's going to talk about how they do seasonal storage. They call it the entire continent takes the month of August off. So I think that's how they deal with serving industrial load in August, right? So for many of you, Professor O'Malley needs no introduction, but Professor Mark O'Malley, University College Dublin, longtime ESIG collaborator, really brought some international perspective and to ESIG. Super happy he's got a pretty big announcement that he wants to get out today. So I'm excited to hand it over to Mark. So Mark, please take it away.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You sound great.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, thanks, Rick. So hello, everybody. So I'm very glad to be here to talk about the Global Power System Transformation Consortium. Just to be clear, I'd like to thank all my colleagues who went before me because they've really teed it up very nicely for me. I will not be exactly agreeing with them all. I'm a little bit of pushback on some of the things that were said. And Rick agreed that we wouldn't have any sort of jokes like he just made, so I'll try and refrain from making any response to Rick. So the Global Power System Transformation Consortium. I'll just push the slides ahead here. So Mike in the slides showed this graphic, which is the Towards 100% Renewable Energy Pathways report. This is a report that came from a workshop that ESIG ran in May 2019 in Denver. And this, plus multiple other initiatives and people in the background, all came to form the GPST. I mean, I just wanted to highlight this because it's the ESIG contribution to it, but there was other things going on at the same time that led to the formation of GPST. So ESIG has had a big role in the formation of it and is a big participant in the initiative. So what is it, who is it, and why? So it's a global consortium, and it's there to support the power system operators with advanced low emission solutions. Because at the end of the day, the power system operators are the people. I mean, a lot of things that my colleagues spoke about, it does end up on the doorstep of the system operators about how to operate this, how to plan it, et cetera, et cetera. So they are, in my view, at the sharp end of the deployment of this. The who of this is that it really, at the moment, it breaks down into three groupings: what we call the founding system operators, the core team, and the developing country system operators. The founding system operators are ERCOT, AEMO, which is in Australia, National Grid, ESO, the UK, California, in California, EirGrid in Ireland, and EnergyNet in Denmark. And the reason that these six system operators are the founders is because if you look at their penetrations of renewables and their ambitions, these are probably, they're not all the leading six system operators, but, largely speaking, in the top 10, these are all the top 10 system operators in terms of penetration of variable renewables. The core team is made up of the research organizations around this, and you can see ESIG there, NREL, IEEE, GTU, EPRI, et cetera. That's the core team of researchers. And I've got some example developing country system operators, and you'll see why they're there in a moment when I talk about the actual work program that we're doing. The why, I don't think I need to say the why because it was made very clear by my colleagues before me, that we need to do this more quickly. I mean, the electricity system needs to decarbonize very quickly. And, the system operators are there. And this is where I'll push it back against a bit about what Mike said, getting to 90%. He said some research is needed. I think it's more than some. I think a lot of research is needed. But I think it's something that we can do. I think it's not, we don't need to have an amazing scientific breakthrough. I think we just need to do really good engineering research to get it done. So the pace and scale is such that we really need to accelerate it. And the GPST is all about bringing together globally the system operators who face the problem at the high end of those accounting system operators, get them to work together, work with these research organizations to accelerate everything. That's the basic concept of the GPST. I mean, why system operators? I think I've said some of this already. I mean, there's lots of people involved in this. I'm not saying that they're the only people, but if you were to pick out one group of people, one set of organizations that are really important in terms of making this happen, it is the system operators. I mean, there's also distribution system operators and other players, etc. But I would reckon they're the single most important organizations. So they're responsible for implementing it. So it's pretty clear. Policymakers and governments and people like that, they do tend to rely on their system operators. They will ask them, is this possible? And if the system operator says it's not possible, then you lose the initiative. The system operators feel they're confident that it can be done, then it'll happen quicker. And that's really a large part of what we're trying to do, is that the system operators will work with each other and they say, listen, we haven't done this part yet, but we know the guys in Australia have done it, or the US, so that's part of the initiative, is to sort of get them to share their experiences so we accelerate it everywhere. They're the people who are responsible for this, and again, from a confidence point of view, you won't attract private investment if there's huge amounts of curtailment, etc. So it's important to get the investors' confidence in this. And also the system operators, like everyone else, they like their own types. I mean, system operators believe other system operators before they would probably believe other people. And that's just natural human nature. So by getting them to work together, they can sort of reinforce each other. And also in terms of some of the issues that were talked about by Paul, I mean, they are, again, at the leading edge of this, electrification, cross-sector coupling, heat, transport, etc. So they're also at that forefront. So that's why the system operators are so important in this. The GPST then, in terms of its actual work, breaks down into 5 areas. We call them pillars, 5 key pillars. System operator, research and peer learning, that's the part that I'm involved with, and ESIG leads it, as you see, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. And that's the one that I really should attract the attention of this audience. So the next few slides are about that. The system operator technical systems, this is really about taking the knowledge and information that those system operators develop and other ones and make sure it goes, and it's global, where we intend to push this information or educate across the world. So that's the role, and NREL leads this part of the initiative. Foundational workforce development, obviously, we think we need new curriculum. I mean, the whole power system is changing, so Imperial College London is leading that initiative. Localized technology adoption and support is the IEEE, who've also developed their website, I'd have to say, which I'll show you the URL for now in a minute. And then open data and tools. And this is to try and produce tools and models that globally people can use to do the analysis around this area. The core team works across all these. I mean, ESIG leads the system operator research and peer learning part, but NREL, Imperial, IEEE, and others are all involved, obviously. There's some regional leads, because this is global. We've got South Africa, Asia, South America there represented. The interim secretariat of this initiative is NREL, and this initiative came out of NREL. I was with NREL until very recently. I'm still working very closely with them. So NREL are currently the interim secretariat, which we'll see what happens. They may stay as the secretariat, they may not, but they'll be involved one way or the other. I've used this slide. This slide is very busy, and I don't intend to go into the huge, but to show that there's, we have thought this through. We have the GPST consortium, those 3 groups of people, founding system operators, core research group, some of the other system operators. We produce research tools, localized technology solutions. We're not going to do this alone. We know that there's a lot of other people in the world involved in this space, the IEA, USAID, etc., various over there. We've been in contact with all these people. We're going to work with them. We're not here to duplicate other people. But the impacts are, to try and get the private sector to invest more because they feel more confident that, more and more renewables can put onto the system without curtailment, etc. That means they feel confident about it. If system operators do their job well, you can, really reduce costs and maintain reliability. And obviously, number 3 is probably the single most important, significant emissions reduction. Where you can put lots of renewables on a power system, but if you curtail them, you don't get as much emissions reduction. And, increased system reliability and resilience. I mean, there is arguments you made that renewables are, can actually add to reliability. I mean, done wrongly, they can take away from it, but done rightly, they can probably add to it. And then obviously jobs and economic development. And I think Mike and Amol, I think, spoke about that well. Go to the next slide. So I thought it was, I toyed with the idea of not showing this slide, but I think that a lot of people have a lot of questions about this part of the consortium. So I decided to show it to sort of preempt some questions, and I'm not going to go through it line by line anyway. Just to be clear, the GPST itself is not a legal entity. We're not forming a legal entity in any way, and funding for it, there will be no funding. The GPST is a group of people came together. They form, an alliance, a group of people. It's not a legal entity in any way. So the GPST itself does not get funding or, it's not taking responsibility. What it is, though, is that the way we set it up is that, and I'm going to use Pillar 1, which is the one that I'm involved with as an illustration, that the rest of it is very similar. But basically what will happen on the research side is that the funding we're going to go after is the typical funding, the Department of Energy, the EU Horizon 2020 program, EPSR, NSF, Science Foundation Ireland, the various research organizations around the world that already fund work in this area, and that the contracts and will be with some national research institutes, but they will have agreed with the research agenda group, which I'll speak about, and the FAM and system operators, that they're going to do work in this whole agenda. They're going to take on various parts of it, and we will support them in terms of letters of support, data, people, etc., from the center of it. So they'll be able to make their application for the funding agency, but they'll have this enormous global support behind them, which should enhance their chances of success. Okay, so system operators, the part of it that I'm involved with is the research agenda group. So we brought together the CTOs equivalent from the 6 system operators with some of the researchers. And we went through an extensive process of trying to develop a set of research priorities. I just put this slide up to show that we developed 61 R&D questions. We broke it down. We prioritized it. We had some surveys, and we're right in the middle now of finalizing this process and coming up with 4 or 5 starting points for research projects that we intend to try and get funded very shortly. And my last slide then is this. So we've identified 4 programs. We will share these with people very shortly. We're going to become public with this. And this is actually the first public airing of GPST. GPST has only really existed in terms of private closed meetings. So this is the first public airing of GPST. But in the next month, there'll be lots of slideshows about it at various events around the world. This is the very first. We've identified 4 research programs: analytic tools and methods, IBR design and economics control in the future, planning and IBR, etc. And like I said, we will show more details of those. My own observations about it is, largely speaking, the system operators have come to the, if you just sort of summarize it, it's the characteristics of the inverter-based resources that are the key issue for them to get at very high penetration levels. Will the system be stable, etc.? Can they do protection, all these good things. So that is the core part. It's not the only part, but it is certainly the dominant part. The control room is at the heart of the issue. At the end of the day, these people want to operate their systems, so the control room is very important. What's very clear is that our initial assessment that it needs a global community has been reinforced time and time again, and even on a call last night and this afternoon that I was on. It is about the global community coming together to form a critical mass, a community of people who will share, so to accelerate things. And my last point is, we've accomplished much. I think that's a very good point made by Paul. We're back at 10%. We're looking at 90%, etc. So we have accomplished a lot. And the graphic over there shows that the only time we should look back is to see how far you've come. There's much more to be done, and it's different. And I think it's very important. This is a different evolution than previously. A lot of the problems you saw before are done. They're finished. They're largely, we know them. The next iteration is significantly different in terms of its characteristics. So let's get stuff done. I won't go into it, but that 5-letter word in a minute stuff was a different word initially. And you're all welcome. You're the first people in the world to see the website there. Go to it, globalpsc.org. It became live in the last few days, and you're welcome to go and look for more. Thank you, Rick. I'm finished.
Great. Thank you, Mark. That was great. And excited to see GPST come together and be presented publicly. You know, I think a lot of the work that's come is really due to your leadership, and so I'm excited for that. I'm going to go ahead and invite the panelists to go ahead and you know, pop yourselves on video. I really appreciate everyone's done some fantastic work on doing some really good questions. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and just quickly address, because, you know, I was one of the co-authors with Amol, and quickly address some of the top questions, which were really around transmission and curtailment. And so the 90% study that we did, we used reads as our primary tool, similar to NREL's REF study, and then with Plexos. And so reads is a co-optimization, generation, and transmission. And if you read our report carefully, you'll see, you know, in the report and in the appendix that, you know, we had sort of medium confidence on the transmission results. So reads builds $100 billion worth of transmission more than in the sort of base case, where we're not deploying a lot, you know, nearly as much wind and solar. So I think, and NREL is busy working, and this fall they're going to release a new version, which I think does a better job of doing transmission. I think part of the problem is because of the way Reed's time slices work, they're seeing storage as a perfect substitute for transmission. So I think it probably underbuilds transmission a little bit. I would say that, you know, our results directionally wouldn't change. So if you added another $100 billion of bulk transmission, it wouldn't necessarily change the, you know, results significantly at all. Because remember, we're investing over $1 trillion in wind, solar, and storage over the next 15 years. So, and then the next question that people ask is sort of about curtailment being 14%, then saying, well, okay, if I take 90% minus 14%, that's 76%. So it doesn't really work that way. So the 90% that we put in Reed, so Reed has about 6% curtailment in it, so that 90% is after curtailment. And then when we ran through Plexos, we got a little bit more curtailment. And I think there's a couple of things going on. Number one, Plexos wasn't optimizing from a cost perspective in a real system where you'd have a clean energy standard. You know, prices would do different things, and we'd probably get a slightly different dispatch. And then I think also, again, that curtailment is really coming from Reed's really underbuilding transmission. So if you built more transmission, that would address that curtailment problem. So it's definitely not the 76% study. It's definitely the 90% study. So those are, and then just really quickly, some people asked some really small questions. You know, the gas price forecast we used was AEO 2020. Somebody asked about what baseline we used. It's 90% clean generation in 2035. So it's not like a 90% reduction from some year baseline. But then I think, you know, somebody asked this really good question at the very beginning, which was, you know, when this person first asked this question, I think while I was still introducing the panel, I thought, well, that question is just too broad. But I think actually it's a great question now, given that we've got this great panel to address this. So somebody said, well, what's the realistic limit on renewable penetration? You know, so from an economic perspective, from a technical perspective, they didn't ask this, but I think that's so maybe if I can just throw that out to maybe start with Paul, and then if others want to chime in on, I think Paul and Mark for sure, and if Mike and Amol want to chime in, welcome. But how would you address this realistic limit on renewable penetration? I think, Paul, your presentation did a good job of addressing this, but do speak more.
Yeah, well, the technical limit is 100%, but it might be more than 100% how you define things. So, you know, if we electrify things, maybe we can get to more than 100%, or we should get to more than 100%. But in all seriousness, from an economic standpoint, you know, my personal issue is at the point at which the marginal cost of renewables is more expensive than the alternative source with an appropriate social cost of carbon. And to me, you know, that number is somewhere between 90 and 100%. I don't know what that is, but I mean, we just did some analysis where we got to 97% before things just went crazy. So I'm not sure I can add much more than that.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Mark, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I like the way, I mean, Paul finished up the slide deck showing, maybe we should just get to 90 and then, go with some other technology. So I'm in that camp myself. I mean, I was on a phone call with some people in the nuclear industry yesterday, and, they were trying to make the case that, well, if we're trying to go to decarbonization, we definitely need nuclear. And my view would be, for example, if nothing else changed, if we just stopped all technological development and everything else stayed the same, you probably would have to go with nuclear to get 100% decarbonization, so not 100% renewable. So, because let's be clear about it, Rick, we're not after 100% renewables, we're after 100% decarbonization. But,
Correct.
like Paul just said, I mean, and I think that the slides shown by Amol at the start are very, very informative. I mean, who would have thought that solar and wind would be as cheap as they are today 10 years ago? No one, like absolutely no one. I mean, I remember people being very enthusiastic, but all of a sudden the enthusiasm, I mean, they underestimated how much it went. So I think that, and we have like 30 years or, we have 20, 30 years to do it. So, let's see what happens. But if nothing else happens, 100% decarbonization, it's probably nuclear. But let's see what happens. Just to be clear as well, in terms of GPST, one of the things that became very clear is that the system operators, the focus for them, because they're so pushed now in terms of getting to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%, their focus is mainly on the next 10 years. They're not ignoring the next 20 years. So the focus of GPST at the moment does not look at the last 10%, but they know they have to. So that's my answer. If nothing else changes, it's nuclear.
Okay. So the nuclear option from Professor O'Malley. Amol, I know you recently published with Energy Innovation just a short little fact sheet on, a thought experiment on the last 10%. You want to talk a little bit about that work and what it brought to light for you?
Yeah, I guess I have a joke about the last 10%. It's like I saying to my wife, okay, I'm going to have a 6-pack on my 50th birthday while I order my Indian food. But that being said, we were tempted to assess the last 10%. I guess I actually feel that I did that exercise just because I'm a nerd, but I don't think it has any meaning. I'm just blunt here. Because look, I do believe that the way storage technology costs have changed, the way solar costs have changed, what is happening in the transportation sector, people are talking about 10-minute fast charging. I don't think we have a good idea what technology will ultimately play out. So I think we are at a point where we say that the conventional technology can get us to 80, 90%. I think policy has to take the leap of faith for the last 10% and announce 100% policy by 2035. What's the worst going to happen? That we will fall back to 90% or 85%. That being said, so then there is enough. So it actually will push innovation in the American power system that, okay, there is this last 10% that we still need to figure out. And technology, companies will invest. So it's very important to set that policy. And then we can guess. So just our guesses of the last 10%, what we find very interesting is the graph that Paul showed, that you have a lot of curtailed electricity in the springtime. So we essentially have a summer problem. So we did some analysis. We basically looked at 3 hydrogen pathways and looking at like automotive fuel cells, because although stationary fuel cells are very expensive, automotives are cheap. They have very low life, but you need, like that CT, you would need to operate those at a very low capacity factor. So who cares if their operational life is low? And interestingly, what we find is that that's the last 10%. I've shared that link in the chat. The last 10% costs about 10 to 12 cents per kWh. So it's not going to break the bank. That's our hypothesis. And I'm pretty confident that we are going to be wrong on this analysis. Once the policy is set, there will be some other solution. Just to give an example, like what Paul mentioned about linking of the sectors, one idea that is not really explored is that you could run electrolyzers during the spring months and really overbuild renewables and get value out of the curtailed electricity that kind of doesn't restrict you to overbuild renewables. I'll stop here, but I think that solutions will come if the policy is set.
Right. And so, yeah, I think that's right, Amol. I think that's really helpful. So, Paul, I know that you had, and so to be clear, Amol's report that I worked on, we didn't address the inverter-based generation issue that Mark O'Malley brought up. You I think you nicely sort of framed the problems into sort of balancing versus, inverter-based generation problems. And you really focus on the balancing problems, which I think is right. How solvable is your sense from sitting where you are today of the inverter-based issues like inertia? For those who haven't seen it, by the way, Paul did a fantastic little video and short paper on inertia. If you just Google NREL inertia, you'll find it. But in your sense, how big an issue are the IBR problems versus the balancing issues?
Yeah, I have to be a little bit careful here just because there's a lot of thinking on this, and it's not just about inertia. I think inertia is the thing that people kind of gravitate towards as kind of this catch-all, and there's really a lot of way more complicated issues because actually inertia is probably maybe the easiest of this. Look, so if you're interested in inertia, forget about the paper that I did with Rick, forget about the little video we did. So just if you really want to be an engineer, go and read the stuff that ERCOT has done. There's some fantastic presentations, some fantastic papers. Look at their calculations on critical inertia. Then for yourself, calculate the amount of inertia you need if you take ERCOT's requirements and the West requirements and the East requirements. This isn't really hard math. So start with ERCOT, add all that inertia up, calculate how much inertia that you'd need you get from the existing hydro fleet, and then say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to do smart grid, complicated grid forming inverters. I'm just going to build synchronous condensers. Calculate how much you need, and then look at the cost of that. And I think you will be very, very pleasantly surprised at how much of a nothing burger inertia actually is. Don't take my word for it. Do the math yourself, and we can then go from there, and we can talk about the more complicated issues like system strength. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. But, sorry, I didn't mean to bias you to by starting to talk about inertia, but I was really hoping you'd talk about all the things, not just inertia, system strength, transient stability, of course. So there's the broader picture of IBRs.
Sure. So it is a bunch of other stuff. I mean, system strength and the ability to inject large amounts of fault current in the system, but it's just engineering. We just oversize the inverters and oversize the capacitors and all the inverters, maybe use some synchronous condensers. But when you look at the costs, I mean, you can also do the back of the envelope where you just say, okay, we just, keep all the existing generators, turn them all into synchronous condensers. And when you compare that to hydrogen and, the trillions of dollars of wind and solar that we need just to decarbonize, I mean, these are pretty small numbers, and it's primarily just engineering problems. So they're really cool engineering problems. I love thinking about them and working on them, but, when we're thinking about the economics of this, it's like, 10% of the problem compared to everything else.
Okay. Mark, would you agree with that, Paul?
Sorry. Next call. Somebody's got their So I mean, I would largely agree with what Paul said. I mean, the inertia issue in its own right is exactly as Paul said. You can solve it that way. I would be a little bit concerned though. The inertia issue has knock-on effects into the stability issues, etc., and location. So putting in a bunch of synchronous condensers may seem great, but there's other issues as well about location, etc. So my take on it is that the issue is it's not so much about grid forming or grid following. It's can we all please sort of agree on some standard and get on with it? I mean, that's the problem is that, you've got all these different types of inverters and all these different things going on. I mean, if you had one system operator for the world and they decided on a solution, they could just implement it. At the moment, you got to make sure the different players, the different markets all sort of coalesce on one solution. I mean, synchronous generators were easy because they're synchronous generators and that's it. Inverters, by their very nature, some of them just changed the software in them, or the code, and they behave totally different. Synchronous machines were much simpler, and therefore they were standardized. So this standardization issue is part of the problem. But I'd agree with Paul. But while I'd agree with Paul on the economic side, it is still a very difficult problem to solve, that you have got to get all these manufacturers, all these systems to sort of agree on a way of doing this. We can do it, but they have to agree on it. And they're all now arguing over which is the best way to do it. And at some stage, someone's going to have to say, listen, it may not be perfect, but here's a way of doing it. But the default is that one of the defaults, part of it is what Paul just said.
Right. Well, Mark, I think that's a great role for GPST to play, is like really helping, because, you know, I'm surprised that the Irishman is suggesting the benevolent dictator version of the system operator. But, you know, hopefully GPST can help bring all these system operators together and help sort of fast track these standards that we need, because I absolutely agree that those standards. So, but unfortunately, I need to wrap up. We're at a quarter past. This was a fantastic panel. We could keep talking for probably 3 hours. And I really appreciate everyone's outstanding questions. There was one that I wish we could gotten to, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to. Please, everybody, remember that for the next session on Tuesday, same time, we're going to keep this fall workshop going Tuesdays and Thursdays. So please tune in. We've got fantastic sessions coming up. I know I carefully added them all to my calendar. So I'm really looking forward to it. Looking forward to it. And that being said, yes. Oh, actually, it's perfect. The next panel is actually going to deal exactly with this issue. You're going to hear from Julia from ERCOT talking about weak grids and low inertia systems. So it's like almost a segue. We finish up this panel talking about what's going to happen at the next panel. Normally, the next panel will be happening after a 15-minute coffee break. Where, you know, somebody would mark, hopefully people would assault Mark. But with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you so much for everyone participating and asking fantastic questions. And I look forward to seeing everyone virtually on Tuesday, October 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for challenges with weak grids and low inertia systems.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone.